At a little after 7 on a Monday morning in 1911, a workman entered the Louvre through a door reserved for employees. He wore a white work smock. He knew the rooms. And before most of Paris had finished breakfast, he walked back out with a painting hidden under that smock. Nobody stopped him. The painting was the Mona Lisa. The Louvre did not realize she was gone until the next day. By then, the frame was lying on a service staircase, and the thief had disappeared into Paris. The most famous museum in France had no suspect, no useful trail, and an empty place on the wall. For 28 months, the investigation went everywhere except the right address. Police jailed the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. They questioned Pablo Picasso. Newspapers imagined international gangs and secret collectors. All that time, the man who had taken the painting was living only a few miles away. This was not a perfect crime. It had no tunnel, no weapons, and, according to the thief, no accomplice. It worked because Vincenzo Peruggia looked exactly like a man who belonged there. This is how one workman stole the Mona Lisa, and how the theft helped turn a celebrated painting into the most famous face on earth. The Mona Lisa is smaller than the legend around her, about 31 inches high and 21 wide. Leonardo painted her in oil on a thin panel of poplar, not canvas. She is generally identified as Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant. Leonardo began the portrait in Florence in the early 1500s and kept working on it for years. He eventually carried it with him to France, where King François I probably acquired it in 1518. That detail matters, because nearly 4 centuries later, Peruggia would claim he was rescuing a painting stolen from Italy by Napoleon. The Mona Lisa was not one of Napoleon's trophies. By 1911, the painting was already admired. Writers had spent decades turning the smile into a mystery, and artists treated Leonardo as a master, but she was not yet the universal celebrity she is now. At the Louvre, she hung among other Italian paintings in the Salon Carré, a small portrait in a crowded room of masterpieces. The museum around her was enormous, old and surprisingly trusting. Objects had disappeared before. Workers, copyists, and photographers moved through the galleries. Paintings could be taken down for cleaning or photography, without every guard immediately knowing where they had gone. One of the men who understood that system was Vincenzo Peruggia. He was an Italian immigrant from Dumenza, who had settled in Paris and worked as a decorator and glazier. His employer, the Gobiai firm, sent him into the Louvre to clean paintings and help fit protective glass. He learned the doors, the staircases, and the white smock that made a worker almost invisible. Monday, August 21st, was the Louvre's weekly closing day. Shortly after 7 in the morning, Peruggia entered with the workmen. He was no longer assigned to the museum, but nothing about him looked unusual. A familiar face in familiar clothes passed through a familiar door. He crossed the ground floor, climbed the main staircase, and entered the Salon Carré. There were no visitors. The walls were crowded from paneling to ceiling, but the portrait he wanted was easy to reach. It hung from ordinary wall fittings beneath a much larger painting. Peruggia lifted the framed Mona Lisa from the wall and carried it into the nearest service staircase. The theft had begun, but it still looked like museum work. Paintings were moved. Workmen carried things. The disguise was not a mask, it was permission. On the stair landing, he started taking the object apart. The decorative frame and protective case made the portrait too large and obvious. He removed them and left them behind. What remained was Leonardo's poplar panel, still priceless, but now small enough to conceal. He wrapped the panel in his white smock and went down toward the ground floor. Then the simple plan nearly failed. The service door would not open. Peruggia removed its handle, but he still could not release the lock. At that moment, another museum worker came down the stairs. He saw a workman trapped behind a door with a missing handle. He did not see an art thief. Unaware of what was under the smock, he used his key and let Peruggia through. Peruggia crossed rooms on the ground floor and walked out through the Porte Jean Goujon onto the Quai du Louvre. He threw the door handle into a roadside ditch and headed toward his lodgings near Rue de l'Hôpital Saint-Louis. There was no chase. Paris did not yet know a crime had happened. He was supposed to report to another job that morning. He arrived late and blamed the delay on a night of drinking. Behind him, the Louvre was still closed to the public. The empty hooks in the Salon Carré passed unnoticed. At home, Peruggia hid the painting in a small storage space beside his room, used for firewood. For months, it had no proper protection. Later, worried about damp damaging the panel, he built a wooden container for it. The Mona Lisa had left a palace for a workman's room. On Tuesday morning, the Louvre reopened. The painter Louis Beyrou entered the Salon Carré, intending to work from the collection. Where the Mona Lisa should have been, he saw bare wall and empty fittings. At first, that did not mean theft. An attendant assumed the painting had been taken to the museum's photography studio. Beyrou waited. Someone went to check. The studio did not have it. Neither did the restorers. The uncertainty moved up the chain until the answer became unavoidable. Nobody at the Louvre had authorized the painting's removal. Doors were closed. Police entered the galleries. The museum began searching a building with thousands of rooms, corridors, cupboards, and exits. On a service staircase, investigators found the abandoned frame and glass. The painting itself was gone. A portrait made on wood had been carried cleanly out of the museum, leaving behind everything that made it look too large to steal. The police examined people who had worked inside the Louvre, including the labor force that knew its hidden roots. French records later sent to the Florence court show that workers were investigated, but the inquiry did not resolve on Peruggia. The useful facts existed. They never became a useful answer. The Louvre closed while investigators searched. When it reopened, crowds came to the Salon Carré and stared at the vacant place. The missing painting had become an exhibit. Newspapers reproduced her face again and again, sending the same question around the world. Where is the Mona Lisa? The first dramatic lead began with a different Louvre thief. Jairi Pierre, a Belgian adventurer who had once worked for the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, had stolen ancient Iberian sculpture from the museum years earlier. After the Mona Lisa vanished, he boasted about those thefts to a newspaper. That was dangerous, because two of the stolen stone heads were sitting in Pablo Picasso's apartment. Picasso had bought them through Pierre and used Iberian forms while developing the faces in his modern paintings. Now he and Apollinaire were connected to genuine stolen property from the Louvre. The frightened men tried to return the heads through the newspaper without revealing their names. The plan failed. Police arrested Apollinaire and held him for 6 days. Picasso was brought before a magistrate and questioned. They were not innocent of everything surrounding the stolen sculptures, but neither man had taken the Mona Lisa, and police had no evidence that they had. The most famous names in modern art became suspects because the investigation found one real Louvre crime while searching for another. Other theories filled the space: a wealthy collector, a political plot, a gang working across borders. The scale of the embarrassment seemed to demand a grand conspiracy. The actual thief remained in Paris, with the painting hidden near his room. Peruggia later insisted that he acted alone, and he stayed consistent through repeated interrogations. The Florence case file found no accomplice. His advantage was not a criminal organization. It was the ordinary knowledge of a former employee. For 2 years and 3 months, he kept the Mona Lisa in Paris. Outside, the stolen portrait moved through newspapers, cartoons, and postcards. People who had never entered the Louvre learned the shape of her face because she was missing. The theft did not create the Mona Lisa's artistic importance. She had been praised for centuries, but it gave her something different: worldwide popular recognition. An empty wall, endlessly photographed, turned one Renaissance portrait into a modern media icon. By 1913, Peruggia needed an ending. Court records show that he explored possible sales and spoke of the fortune he expected to make. He also continued to describe the painting as something that should return to Italy. Patriotism and profit were becoming difficult to separate. On November 24, 1913, Peruggia wrote to Alfredo Geri, an art dealer in Florence. He signed the letter Leonard V. He said he possessed Leonardo's missing painting and wanted to bring it back to Italy, while also asking whether Geri was interested in acquiring it. Geri first suspected a joke. Then he showed the letter to Giovanni Paggi, director of the Uffizi Galleries. They answered carefully and asked to see the painting before discussing any arrangement. Peruggia took the bait. On December 10th, he arrived in Florence, carrying a rough wooden box with a false bottom. He checked into the Hotel Tripoli, a modest hotel on Via Panzani, and met Geri at the dealer's shop. The next afternoon, Geri and Paggi followed him back to the hotel. Peruggia opened the wooden container and lifted out a thin painted panel. For more than 2 years, the world had known the Mona Lisa mainly through reproductions. Now the original was standing in a hotel room. Paggi believed it could be genuine, but said the light was too poor for a final judgment. He proposed taking it to the Uffizi. Peruggia agreed. At the museum, the panel, its surface, and the marks on its reverse matched the Louvre's painting. Paggi told Peruggia that officials in Rome would need to be consulted before anything else happened. Then the dealer and museum director stopped negotiating and contacted the authorities. The Mona Lisa stayed at the Uffizi. On December 12th, while Peruggia waited for Geri to call, police arrived at the Hotel Tripoli and arrested him. In his room, they found the box, work tools, personal effects, and the letters that had led him there. Peruggia confessed immediately. He said he had taken the painting alone and wanted to restore an Italian masterpiece to Italy. He believed, or said he believed, that France had stolen it during Napoleon's campaigns. But Leonardo had brought the portrait to France himself, and François I had acquired it centuries before Napoleon. The Florence court also saw evidence that complicated the patriotic story: letters to Peruggia's father about an approaching fortune, an earlier attempt to find a buyer in London, and contacts with more than one dealer. The judges rejected the claim that he had acted entirely without self-interest. He was convicted and sentenced to 1 year and 15 days. On appeal, that became 7 months and 8 days, time he had already served while awaiting judgment. The man behind the most famous art theft of the age walked free. The recovered Mona Lisa spent 5 days on public view at the Uffizi, then traveled through Italy under guard. She was formally returned to French custody in Rome and reached the Louvre again in January 1914. The painting came home more famous than when it left. Today she sits behind climate-controlled glass, protected as both a fragile poplar panel and a global icon. The theft is part of that icon. Vincenzo Peruggia did not defeat an elaborate security system. He passed through an institution that mistook familiarity for permission and walked out carrying the face the world would never forget.